Welcome to Social Steps, a series of conversations with people around the world who are creating positive change and social impact. I am Luis Guilherme, and I initially would like to announce that Social Steps is celebrating its first birthday, and I feel surprised in the best way possible to see how numerous things this podcast achieved in a short period of time. Since the beginning, the Social Steps podcast has welcomed professors and researchers from prestigious universities, professionals from respected international organizations, and more recently, former ministers who have spoken about their professional journey and personal experiences on some of the most pressing matters that face our world today. Social Steps has listeners in more than 20 countries. A family that extends in every continent in the world. And I send my warmest gratitude to everyone who follows this podcast. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, I would like to talk to you, Lucian. It's a pleasure to have a great friend of mine as my co-host at this special moment. Could you introduce yourself and welcome?
Hey Luis, it's a great pleasure to be on your podcast, especially for your podcast anniversary. So my name is Lucian. I am from Singapore, a very small island in Southeast Asia, and I work as a user experience designer in a tech company. So right now, my job it mainly revolves around designing digital products to be more friendly to people, and I think that eventually also extends to really trying to make people consume less and also reduce any sort of operational inefficiencies. Now, what really got me started with environmental issues was really just an appreciation of the green spaces we have in Singapore, despite the fact that it's so small and it's so developed, but the government has spent a lot of effort in keeping the places really green. So no matter where you go, you're bound to see some sort of green space, whether it's a tree, bushes, or even just grass. How I really got into environmental issues is when I started reading up about the state of the world. We started to hear, I think the earliest thing I've ever heard of was mainly about the hole in the ozone layer and how that would affect the weather and stuff. That slowly became a big thing that I started to look into various issues such as climate change, even resources, where does water come from. It's quite amazing how in this tiny little island where we have no resources, we've always been taking for granted that water comes out of a tap. Honestly, I didn't even know how the aquifers and water sources work until much later in life. And it's just going down that rabbit hole of discovering how a lot of natural resources obtained in very convoluted way in Singapore compared to the rest of the world, like electricity, water, and stuff. So I've also been volunteering with a few organizations in the past, and it's quite amazing to see the biodiversity in Singapore despite the very small size. And I think it's very inspiring because it really, despite the small size of Singapore, it really gives sort of an example of what it could be, where we have a lot of development, but we don't really lose out on maintaining certain natural spaces. So when I heard of this opportunity to do a podcast with Dr. Jacob Ibrahim and through a very nice friend, Luis, who somehow from Brazil managed to get his attention, I knew I had to join in. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you for your time and attention. I really hope you enjoyed this dialogue. It's especially fitting that we are in such an episode for today's conversation by accomplished politician, foreign minister and distinguished guest, and scholar Jacob Ibrahim. Jacob's remarkable career has been an interweaving of intellectual and political life. Because of that, he has had a profound impact not just in academia, but also on policy to promote innovation and the balance of economic growth, and environmental protection. In this episode, Jacob Ibrahim shares his fascinating experiences at the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, current Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore. He talks about his involvement in climate change conferences in Bali, Copenhagen, and Cancun, the intersections of sustainability and technology, the importance of public transportation to a healthier environment, and other crucial aspects of what cities can do to ensure the well-being of their residents. Jacob started his career as a member of parliament in Jalan Besar and held several positions at the highest levels of the government of Singapore. Apart from his work at the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, he also served as a minister in the Ministries of Community, Development and Sports, Muslim Affairs, and Communications and Information. His work still has huge impacts for the day-to-day lives of individual citizens in Singapore. Lucian and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. It's rare to get to speak with someone who worked at the highest levels of climate and environmental politics. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. And just a final message before your special conversation: don't forget to follow Social Stats Podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube to support your work. So, very well, let's go to your conversation. Jacob, we feel highly honored to have you as our guest on Social Stats Podcast to talk about your remarkable career and work at the Singapore government. A commitment to public service whose effects still have a profound impact on the lives of millions of people. Your deepest gratitude to your time, Professor Jacob.
Thank you to be here, Luis, and thank you for having me here. It's really an honor for me to be able to share whatever little experience I may have in the Singapore government with the rest of the world. So I'm happy to answer your questions.
Perfect, Jacob. So to begin our conversation, could you tell us a little bit about your path to the Singapore government? What is the biggest challenge you have faced at work, and how did you overcome this challenge?
Well, I started my career as an engineer. By training, I'm an engineer. So I worked in the private sector for about 4 years, and then I managed to get a scholarship to do my overseas studies and my PhD. Eventually came back and joined the National University of Singapore as a lecturer. At that time, the ruling party, the People's Action Party in Singapore, was looking for young candidates, especially from my community. I'm a minority in Singapore. And at that time, you see a lot more minority members doing quite well, because that's a matter of time before we prove that we are capable as the other communities. So I was called to join politics. And after a long toing and froing, I joined in 97 for the election. And in in the nature of Singapore politics in Singapore is that you can keep your day job and you can be an elected representative, at the rest of the time. So I was an MP and also a lecturer in the university. But in 98, I was invited then by the Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, to join the government. Again, it took me a long time, toing and froing, discussing with my friends. But finally, it was with my wife who decided, say, give it a try. And with her support and blessing, I joined the government in 98. And so that's been my journey. I suppose the challenge I face has always been a sort of a small sense of regret. I always wanted to be an academic. I enjoy the life of a quiet academic, doing work, research, meeting students, and I sort of never could see that to the end, as some of my friends will become a full-fledged academic. But beyond that, I think as a member of the Singapore government, your challenge is always to make sure that the policies are well understood and people understand where the government is coming from. So I of course work very hard, read a lot extensively to make sure that I understand what are the issues, and to make sure that I can communicate that as the best of my abilities to the wider community. So that's a short story. And eventually, as history has shown, I did well enough to be promoted And eventually in 2002, I was invited to join the Singapore Cabinet as a minister. I spent 16 years as a member of the Singapore Cabinet, and then retiring in 2018, and then in 2020 I retired as a member of parliament. So a long 23 years in public service, which I really enjoyed, and it has many challenges, and I don't think we have the time to go through it now, but it's certainly to me a rare opportunity for myself from a minority community to be able to perform at that level and be able to engage at that level. I think was a wonderful opportunity, which I never regretted. Yeah.
And Jacob, who motivated you or influenced you to work for the Singapore government? And why did you choose to work in the public sector?
Well, I suppose for myself, I've always been interested in social issues ever since I was a student leader in the university. And even before that, I've been actively involved in some organizations, charitable organizations. So it was a sort of a natural fit because I see one very important role of any government is to improve the lives of their citizens, basically. So I was motivated to join because I thought maybe within the government I can make a change. I can influence policies to improve the quality of life of ordinary Singaporeans. And I must say that the greatest influence for me is my wife. She basically told me, go and do it, so that you don't come back and regret 30 years later you didn't do it, basically. But I think I'm thankful that she was around to support me and my family. I have two young children at that time growing up. So those are the things that I think sort of motivated me and gave me the comfort that I can do my job. I think the public sector is really an important sector in any country because it's dealing with the public. It's dealing with services, infrastructure, policies that can affect and change the lives of the citizen. Something which I've always wanted to be involved in as an individual. I enjoy working in that space. So that thing, the motivation was intrinsic in that sense. I've always been a part of it. I just have to share a little story. When I first came back to Singapore in 1991, actually I was invited to join at that period by the Prime Minister then. I turned it down. I turned it down because I thought I wasn't ready. And I thought to be an elected representative, you must know the community. You must know the issues. I was away for 6 years in America doing my PhD, getting married, and so on and so forth. But I sort of very difficult at that time. There was no internet, to keep in touch what's going on at home. You rely on once a week to read the newspapers at the university library. So when I came back, I thought I need to spend time with the community. So I volunteered at one of the Malay organization called Mendaki. It is a self-help group started by the government in 1982, dealing with the educational achievements of the community. So I became a volunteer there. I was passionately involved in many projects. But when it came the next time around, the elections of 97, when they asked me whether I'm ready or not, I can't say I'm not ready after 6 years. But I took my time to really deep dive into some of the issues. So I would say that I've always been committed to wanting to do something for society. And I think that's my sort of internal motivation.
I have to say it motivated me to study public policy as well, and sociology, of course.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Jacob, speaking of public sector and creating positive change for millions of people, what sparked your interest in environmental topics?
It's an interesting question because ever since when I was in the US, I got married. We had family housing. There was really a great consciousness in America about environmental issues, and I am one of those who really like to go around and look at student activities that resonate with me. And I found the environmental groups quite enlightened, and the issues are very interesting. Of course, you do have what we would consider a fringe group at that time were very confrontational with government, but there were a lot of groups on campus that were looking at how to save the environment, reduce plastic waste, and so on and so forth. I thought that was something good because you only have one Earth, and what can you do to help it as much as possible? So I became interested in the issue as a postgraduate student. And my wife and I, in particular, have been conscious, ever since that day to recycle as much as possible, do what we can, basically. And so when we came back to Singapore, And when I started my work in the university, I was also engaging some of my colleagues, my professors on campus. Hey, what can we do, to make the campus a bit more greener? At the same time, the late Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was also a person who was very concerned about the environment. One of the things that he always wanted to do was to turn Singapore into a green city, to reduce the heat load so that we don't have to rely too much on air conditioning. I thought that was a brilliant move on his part. So I think there was enough of a concern around us for me to say, this is something which is worthwhile doing. So I became interested in that topic at that period. Even though it was not part of my research as a professor in the university, it was something that I do on the sideline. I joined the Nature Society. I thought I could join a group that was available out there, and the Nature Society was one of those groups that were looking at the environment. And at that time, there was a big debate about conservation. I'm not sure whether Lucian remember this, was about sort of a small marine alcove in Pulau Ubin called Chek Jawa. Chek Jawa was this beautiful conservation place where the natural tides and all that brought a fantastic marine ecosystem, and they wanted to do something about it. But the Nature Society and other groups actually led a campaign against it. And I liked it because they were not confrontational. It was anchored on science and understanding the phenomenon and what it can do. Today, it is still alive. Today, there's a boardwalk that you can walk to enjoy that particular marine ecosystem. So I was really moved by what the Nature Society did. I mean, I became a member before, but I could see that this is the kind of organization I could relate to and something that I want to be a part of. So that's my journey towards what you call environmental politics, but mainly in terms of conservation and the things that we can do and play our part as ordinary Singaporeans.
And Jacob, why did you decide to become a professor after your work for the Singapore government?
I think I've always been a professor at heart. If you were to go back and ask my colleagues in the various ministries, I'm always one of those who likes to read a lot. I will ask for papers. I will do some research on my own to find out about certain issues, basically. I was from the National University of Singapore, a very prestigious university. I took a long leave of absence. So, in fact, when I stepped down in 2018 as a minister, I could actually go back to the University of Singapore. But I thought to myself, it's an established university, a very prestigious university. And I'm not sure whether I have a role in that university, right? So I decided to actually resign from that university and choose another university, which was almost like a startup university, which is the current university I'm in, the Singapore Institute of Technology. It is a small but growing university dealing with students coming from what you would call community colleges. We call them the polytechnics here in Singapore, to upgrade and get a degree. And they come largely from what we call the neighborhood schools, the heartlanders. They are not the elites. They are basically part of the sort of the lower middle class and lower income groups. And I thought that's something I can do to help them, to get their degree and sort of continue to excel and do well in life. Because if they do well, they're able to support their family. So I decided to continue my role as a professor, but in a different university whose mission and cause resonate deeply with me. Basically, I found the mission something that I can relate to, something that I can play a part with, basically, and so I joined the Singapore Institute of Technology as a professor, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. But I don't teach, I don't do research. I have to be very honest. I negotiated a contract where I could do other things. So I'm like the go-to person in many things that the university want to do. But the one area that they have given to me, which I really enjoy, is social innovation. So I do a lot of work in the space of social innovation to understand what are the issues out there in society and how my university, especially our students, can play a role in tackling those issues. So I keep telling all my students that go to these projects, we are not trying to split the atom or find a cure for cancer. We're just looking for small social problems. And if we can solve those social problems, you really improve the quality of life for the beneficiary. Designing a better walking cane for the elderly, for example, will improve, the mobility of the elderly and therefore improve their quality of life. Designing a smart water meter for low-income families who can then monitor their water consumption and reduce their water bill. It really will improve their quality of life. So our problems that we're looking at And we use the word research, I look into those sort of problems. I actually go out meeting various partners in Singapore to identify what are the problems that they may have. And I say, maybe that's a problem I can solve. Just recently, I met an old colleague who's actually working within the prison sector, dealing with ex-offenders. And I said, yeah, maybe there's something my students can do to help the lives of ex-offenders. So we explore the whole landscape. And for me, it's also an eye-opener. Some of the spaces I've never been before. I don't know what incarceration means. I don't know what is life of ex-offender. But getting to that space, I think for my students especially, will help them to develop empathy. And empathy, I think, is a very important value from the work of social innovation. So that's what I do. I'm passionate about it. I'm looking for opportunities, and really, you see the smile on the face of the families and the elderly and the disabled, that we can make a slight difference. I think that's a wonderful outcome, and I can sleep better at night, basically.
Jacob, just a question, if I may ask this question. Most of your students are working in which fields specifically?
It's a very good question, because my university is not organized in the traditional sense. I don't have faculties, I don't have departments. What we have are clusters. So we have 5 clusters. We are the first Singapore University of Applied Learning. So our students are really very hands-on, and our topics are very much related to the economy. So I must apologize, I don't have a department of history, I don't have a department of philosophy. Engineering is a very big cluster. IT is a very big cluster. Health and social sciences is a very big cluster. Food technology and pharmaceutical sciences is a big cluster, and design. So our students come from these varied fields. In fact, your question is very important for me, because when we do our projects out in the field, we want our students to be interdisciplinary. So we have students from various classes coming together. So I have many projects where the students are from the engineering cluster and from the food cluster coming together to see how they can design, for example, a gaming app for low-income families on nutrition. So the engineering student design the app, but in terms of nutrition, it comes from the health sciences students. So it's one of those things that we think collaboration is very important. And really, all the projects that we do is more about our students than about the project. So they develop teamwork, empathy, and really understanding the beneficiaries. They have to go out and meet the beneficiaries. It's not a research that they do in their home or in their classroom. Interacting with the beneficiary is a key factor in our social innovation project.
I can relate that by working with data analysis, having a legal and sociology background. It's interesting to relate. You can see the importance of this two topics, the many intersections of technology and law. Because here in Brazil, it's funny because we have a saying here. I don't know if it happens in Singapore, but here in Brazil, many people say, okay, I went to the law school because I hate the numbers. And numbers are actually, they actually help us.
Yes.
When you monitor or when you are developing or creating a public policy, it's necessary to examine data, know what is happening. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think the world is very interdisciplinary. You cannot look at one problem and say it's an economics problem. It has impact on society and so on and so on.
All right, so the part 2.
Yes.
I think this will be a little bit harder for you, because we're not talking about your current achievements. We'll be asking a lot of questions about your term as the Minister for the Environment and Water Resources in the year 2004 up to 2011.
Yeah.
So just to highlight your achievements, I would say the key things that we want to talk about today. During your term, you co-chaired the Interministerial Committee on Sustainable Development to produce the Sustainable Singapore Blueprint 2009.
Yep.
You also led the Singapore Green Plan 2012. These two comprehensive plans covered strategies on air quality, energy, water, waste management, urban planning, public health, nature conservation, and finally, international cooperation.
Yes.
I think what we really want to hear are the interesting stories that you and the team dealt with creating these critical policies. What were the challenges you faced to accommodate the development needs from a growing population and also the environmental impact that results from it?
Well, I can speak another hour on that subject matter, but clearly, I think the challenges have always been how to find the right balance between economic growth and environmental concerns. I think for the benefit of our listeners, Singapore is a very unique country. We're a small country with hardly any resources except our people. And economic growth is very important because then it creates jobs. Right? Economic competitiveness is important, then it attracts investments and talent to Singapore. That is something which we want to continue to do because without that, we cannot exist as a country. Yet at the same time, we have a very small island. I always have this joke, my friends who come to Singapore from the airport all the way to the western part of the island, because the airport is in the eastern part, it just takes you half an hour by car. It's very short. And so, what little we have is something that we need to preserve as much as possible. And as mentioned, the population is growing, and every young student that comes out from the university or the polytechnic needs a job, and therefore we have to create jobs. Our local sector is not large enough. It is one of the largest employer in Singapore. Our what we call our small and medium enterprises (SMEs), they hire about 70% of our workforce. But really, the kinds of jobs that we are looking for now, because these are the new jobs, are basically created mainly by foreign companies. As mentioned by Luis, in the area of data, ICT, data centers are coming to Singapore, the use of data analytics. Our government is going towards a huge phase of digitalization because we realize that we have to leverage on. So that path is very important. Yet, how do we do this in a way to balance the needs of the environment is the biggest challenge. Convincing not the public, convincing my colleagues in cabinet, convincing people inside government that this needs to be done is the biggest challenge, frankly speaking. It was the biggest challenge. I won't go into details, but we spent many hours convincing our cabinet colleagues why this needs to be done, right? But the one thing I've always liked about this government, not because I was a member of the government, we're very practical. And we realize that it has to be done. It's a question of how you do it and how you pace it in line with economic growth. We don't believe in a blunderbuss approach, and we believe in a gradual evolutionary approach, bringing the population along, changing as we go along. So the plan is a vision. And how do you articulate that vision? I think is left to the various ministries to negotiate, to discuss, and sort of bring it through. So that has always been our biggest challenge, convincing our colleague that it has to be done, convincing our colleague that it can be done with a proper time frame and working those details out. At my level as a minister with Mr. Mabautan, we didn't go into the details. We just look at a broad picture. But the broad picture is important because it then means that we have a target ahead and we want to achieve those targets basically, right? And we have various targets that we lay out in our plan. For example, water conservation, energy conservation, the amount of green cover in Singapore that we want, and so on and so forth. So that I would say, in a very nutshell, without going into too much intimate details, is our challenge. And of course, after that, convincing cabinet and the prime minister and the senior ministers that these are things that need to be done. But I would say on record, Mr. Ma and myself were very grateful that we had the full support of the cabinet. Then after that, you have to convince the public. And that is also the biggest challenge because the public do not see environmental issues as the way they see cost of living or inflation because they're very long term, right? I go into the market and I buy a light bulb. The cheapest light bulb is the tungsten filament, right? If I buy an energy saving light bulb, I have to spend twice the amount. Why should I do that, right? Unless the government steps in and do something about it, they will continue to buy the tungsten filament light bulb, right? Which is not energy saving. So we need to convince them that's not the way to go. And so we spend a huge amount of time in public awareness campaign, going out to the public, convincing them. But there's an important intermediary that I want to share, which is the various NGOs, right? That we have to work together. I mean, that was one of the things that I personally took charge as Minister for Environment and Water Resources, because the environment groups were emerging in Singapore. And I remember telling my colleagues, and this I can share, I said, I've seen what has happened in other parts of the world where the environmental groups become tree huggers, they basically become confrontational. I said, is that what you want in Singapore? Why don't we work with them? And this is very unusual, because for government to work with NGOs, especially in this space, never happened before. Remember the example of Chek Jawa with the Nature Society? It was until the Nature Society came out that the government decided to meet them and discuss. So I said, let's preempt this. Let's work with the NGOs. So we actually set up a unit within my ministry to work with the NGOs, the environmental NGOs, and convince them that we're on the same page, right? We're on the same page, and we provide some resources for them, and they then help us to do the public awareness campaign, public education campaign. And that took a long time, not to convince the NGOs, to convince the civil servants that this is the way to go, because it's a bit messy, right? Dealing with NGOs, they come in many shapes and sizes, they have different demands and wishes. Well, as civil servants, we're very clear. I want to achieve this, this is what I should do basically. But maybe you need to take a side track here, a side track there, and therefore you need to develop those skill sets. But I'm again grateful and blessed that the civil servants I've interacted with were all on the same page. We saw that this is something they all needed to do. So it wasn't that difficult to convince them, right? And then working with the environment groups was very, very helpful. Let me give you one example. Until today, there is a group called the Waterways Watch Society, right? Led by a man called Eugene Hing, great friend of mine. What they do is very simple. They actually go out on weekends on a boat and pick up rubbish from our reservoirs and our waters. It might seem simplistic our mind, but it has a lot of impact. And they needed some help with securing a location and a new boat and so on and so forth. So we stepped in and worked with them and worked with our agencies to find a common ground. Today, they carry out the projects. A lot of people are volunteering with them. And I recently met up with Eugene. We just bumped into each other after a long time. I said, let's catch up for a cup of coffee and share our stories and what we have done in the past. I think it helps to be able to have that process of engaging the NGOs, engaging the VWOs, because it's better to win them over rather than making them our enemies, in this particular challenge. So I'm proud of what we have done during those years. That today I think most of the NGOs are with us in this challenge to deal with the environmental challenge that we face as a small country.
Oh, there's a lot of things you shared. But maybe just to add on to what you've just talked about, a quick question. Like, what do you think was the biggest challenge when it comes to trying to get the Singaporean population to be aware of a certain environmental issue? Which particular issue was the most challenging for you?
Every issue was challenging. It's because, as I said earlier, environmental issues are long term. They can't see it until you can bring the impact almost immediate. Let me give you one example. I mentioned about the energy saving light bulbs. It took us a long time to convince Singaporeans. So much so there were projects at that time conducted by my deputy, Dr. Amy Kong, very brilliant, hardworking lady, working together with a private company. I can't remember the name of the company, but they went into low-income family homes and replaced light bulbs for free, right? So the companies decided to do it. They went into the home, removed the light bulb, and then at the end of the month, show them how much energy they have saved. And then they were convinced, right? The government couldn't have done that. But together with a private sector company in this case, and of course, what we call the grassroots organizations in Singapore, my deputy, Dr. Amy Koh, went out, met the low-income families, convinced them to change, and they were happy with it. Meanwhile, we were actually moving towards the regulatory framework of removing the tungsten filament light bulbs from Singapore. In fact, today you can't find them in Singapore. The policy is such that you can only bring energy-saving light bulbs to Singapore. So that's what we have done also. So that if you go to any shop today, the only light bulbs which are available are energy-saving. But if we have done that without the first part, there will be a riot in Singapore, right? We need to convince people slowly that it makes sense, especially their bottom line. And then after that, you make it such that it's easy for them to transit. So you go to any shops in Singapore to buy light bulbs, they're all energy saving. Very difficult to find that tungsten light bulb, which I grew up with, basically, because that was the time that we used because it was cheap, basically. So those are the challenges that we face. But I think, as I said, having third parties working with us, collaborating with the government agency, I think has been very helpful in conversing the public. Another big challenge we have is water conservation, because the Public Utilities Board, or the PUB, the Water Authority, was under my supervision, and we wanted to bring it down, basically. So we ran campaigns. In fact, what we also do now is that at certain events, like, for example, the launching of a new HDB flat, previously what we used to do is to give them water saving devices. Now we have been able to work with the Housing Development Board, the Housing Authority in Singapore, to install water saving devices in new flats. So there's a lot of steps that we put into convince Singaporeans. And then once you have the water saving devices, you look at it and say, wow, I'm saving money because the water saving devices actually help me. Then people can understand the issues, basically, and I think that's the way to go. It is a long-term issue, but it's something that has to be done now, and the habits have to kick in now, the changes have to kick in now. So there's a lot of effort on our part to engage the public, but also to make the solutions available and affordable. I think that's the way to go, and I think that has been something that I would say that we have done quite well in Singapore.
Yep, you're correct. I think if we look at how those plans have actually panned out, we've been very successful. A lot of the goals that were set during your term have already been achieved.
Yeah.
And so I think we have talked so much about the successes, and just wondering, were there any failures from those plans that you have made during your term?
No, one of the things that was always very difficult is to change Singaporeans' mode of transport. Right? Because transportation is a big issue in Singapore and is one of those things that contribute a huge amount to the carbon footprint. How do you do what we call the modal split? We had a target. Our target was to make sure that Singaporeans spend 70% of their mobility needs on public transport and 30% on private transport. Right? I can't remember the figure during my time, but it was way, way, very low because people like private transport, having their own car. But I have to tell a story, and it's something which has always resonated with me. When I was a professor, I'm staying in the east. My university was, in the west. I used to drive my car, park my car in the car park, spend the whole day doing my work, researching, and then take my car in the evening. I always wonder, why is my car sitting in the car park doing nothing, for 8 hours and then getting heated up because Singapore is very hot, and then I use it just to bring it back in the evening, right? So clearly it's a wasted asset. And worse still is a depreciating asset, as is in the car park, is losing value, basically, right? So it wouldn't be better if I just leave my car in my garage and take public transport, right? So that was one of the things that we wanted to do. But at that time, we couldn't convince Singaporeans because I think our mobility plans were not in place yet. Right? Today, I think the government is fully convinced that it needs to be done, and therefore our network is fantastic. Right? There is even a simple rule that we put in place into our mobility plans to make sure that every Singaporean will have access to a mobility node within 400 meters of your house. It could be a bus stop, it could be a taxi stand, it could be an MRT station. 400 meters. It's quite amazing, actually, right? Because given the heat, you want to be able to walk just enough so that you don't, profusely sweating and you get to your work, basically. So today, I think a lot more people are using public transport, which is good. But I think that's something it should have happened a lot more faster. It was difficult at that time to convince people. In fact, those were the days, you believe it or not, we also had car sharing providers and bicycle providers. I remember we had one company that came to see us and say, we want to do this, It didn't take off because Singaporeans said, why? In this climate, you want me to go and rent a bike and cycle to work or cycle to place? Nobody wants to do it. But today, it's an explosion. People are renting cars, renting bikes, which I think is great, basically. So I wish we could have done that modal split, a lot more quicker. But it's never late, better late than never. And therefore, I think Singaporeans realize that they need to use public transport more than their private transport. In fact, if anything, what's pushing people now today is the high prices of gasoline, basically. So I might as well leave your car and just take the public transport. And the government has done a lot to encourage Singaporeans to use. So, for example, myself, I'm considered an elderly, Luis, in Singapore. I'm 67 years old, so I've crossed that age. I have a special discount when I go on public transport. And if I leave early in the morning and take a train all the way to my workplace and come back, I spend what we will call in Singapore about 50 cents on it, which is very small amount, basically. Probably about 30 US cents or something like that to travel all the way. So I think we are trying to encourage as much as possible. And I think it's the right thing to do. And if we can achieve that modal split, I think that'll be wonderful for Singapore as an outcome. The government, of course, is investing heavily in public transport, buses, trains, and so on and so forth. Even the government has changed their mind. I have to say this. I mean, there was a strong debate that once you have a train line, you remove the buses because then people go on the train line. But we've decided that's not the way to go. We decided to put back the buses together with the train lines because it's complementing rather than replacing. And I think today, for example, it is a lot more convenient to travel in Singapore. It is a huge expense. There's no doubt about that. But I think Singaporeans see the value in it and is prepared to support it because it's convenient, it's accessible, it's affordable, and it helps Singapore to save the environment as much as possible.
Indeed. I'm just going to add a point to this recording because I think might be helpful for users, the listeners, in the sense that Singapore is actually a world-class transportation system. We have really amazing metros and buses, and I speak from experience as someone who's traveled to many cities across the world. But the very interesting point is also that car demand, like private vehicle demand, has also increased a lot for the past years. In fact, this year, we have this system called the Certificate of Entitlement that helps to regulate the market in terms of car ownership. It has hit an all-time high. So it's very interesting that despite the fact that we have a very advanced and comprehensive public transport system, car ownership seems to still be very, very in demand, despite fuel prices.
Yeah. But listen, if I can add to that point, there was a recent survey, I think a couple of days ago, that showed that the demand among young Singaporeans for private transport has come down to own a private car. But here is a very interesting dilemma, and in fact, it's a mystery for me. If anybody out there can solve the problem for me, I would appreciate it. When I meet young people, I always ask them this question. For 20 years of your life, or 24, 25 years, you actually go to your university, your school using public transport. You take the train, you take the bus, The day you graduate, you want to own a car. Why is that? Right? So I think it's something we have to sort of engage the young people, but I think increasingly young people see the need to save the environment, to want to do their part, basically. So the recent survey actually cheered me up that the numbers have come down among young Singaporeans who see the need to have their own car, right? I live in a private estate. One of the bane of the private estate is always people having more than one car, and they park along the road and all that stuff. So a lot of problems. So I think it's something which worthwhile tackling as much as possible. And I think it's good to get young Singaporeans to understand that they have a part to play in making it more convenient. In fact, I'm now hearing young people saying, I don't want to have a driving license. Why? I can get Grab. I can get Uber. I can go anywhere with Grab and Uber. We don't have Uber in Singapore. We have Grab. And that has made it so convenient for them to travel, including my two children. They use Grab all the time. Unfortunately, on my expense, but never mind. That's a side matter.
That's good.
Here, Brazil is a bit different because not only Brazil, to be honest, but it's a problem in entire Latin America. I always speak about this topic with my other friends, colleagues who also work with environmental topics. And the point is that cars are still a symbol of status here.
Yes, I think so too. I think so too in Singapore. Yeah. But I think it's changing slowly. Yeah.
I think it's also this added element that Singapore is also starting to accept electric vehicles.
Yes.
So there's also very big change towards the way that we are consuming carbon in a sense, because now we can rely on cleaner sources of carbon consumption. Exactly. And speaking of carbon, we can start moving on to the other aspect of environmentalism, which is something that we are all very aware of, is climate change.
Yes.
And Singapore has contributed to many significant international climate change conferences. I think for our listeners' reference, in 2018, while Singapore has a really high carbon dioxide emission per capita, ranking 27th in the world, it accounts only for 0.1% of the world's total emissions. Now, Jakob, participating in those international conferences where Singapore is not as critical a stakeholder as, say, China or the United States, it must have been quite an interesting experience. What were the most memorable moments from those conferences?
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned climate change, because as environment minister for 7 years, I was involved, in climate change discussion. Just to take a step back, the former environment minister, Dr. Ahmad Mattar, went to the Rio Summit, and we signed up to the Rio Summit, and all those goals, the Millennium Goals, it's basically something that we commit ourselves, basically. But in terms of a formal commitment to, for example, the Kyoto Protocol and all the climate change, we were not involved during my time. I have to be honest about it. But it was during my time that we decided that we should engage this. You're right, we're a small country. But small country actually have a stake in climate change, because we are the first to be inundated by sea level rise. We're the first to be inundated by any pollution that you have. As we have seen in Singapore, whenever we have forest burning in Indonesia, it will cover the whole of Singapore and part of Malaysia. So we have a stake in this whole debate on climate change. But how do we make our voice be heard, right? So that was our challenge when I came in as environment minister. And I remember this. It was interesting because I attended the first conference I'm sorry to check my memory, right? I did either 2005 or 2006, but I think it's in Montreal. We were not a signatory to KP. We were observers, And so what happened was that we went to the conference and we were seated at the back row, which countries I would want to mention that you don't want to be associated with, basically, So I came back and spoke to my colleagues. I said, we must convince government that we must sign up to the Kyoto Protocol. We're not Annex 1 country, we should be Annex 2 countries. How can we do that? So it became a very long journey for us to convince, especially our colleagues from the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which is understandable, the impact on our economy. And finally, we managed to sign on to it. I think it's 2006, if I not remember, in Poland or one of those places that we went for the meeting. And we became a full signatory. And I think what we also did was that we are not going to be a mere signatory. We want to contribute to that process. I must first take my hat off to all my staff, my colleagues in the ministry who work very hard in this particular endeavor to make sure that when we go to the conferences and the meetings, we really provide useful information, useful ideas and all that stuff. So much so, by the time we arrived at 2007 in Bali in 2008, in fact, Singapore was selected by the country that eventually will host the Copenhagen meeting in 2009 to be a part of this small group of countries to discuss the agreement. The Copenhagen Treaty or Accord, or what you want to call it, was something that we worked with. I still remember my counterpart, Minister Connie Hedegaard from Denmark, very, very astute and profound lady who basically reached out to all of us and said, what can we do? So we were selected. As a small country, Singapore was selected, I think was a tribute to our contribution. So I played my part together with my staff to make sure that we play our part in this particular process. And at the 2009 Copenhagen meeting, as we all know, something happened there. We couldn't reach an agreement, but we were selected. Singapore was selected as one of the countries to co-chair one of the subcommittee. And I co-chaired on basically the marine sector contribution to climate change, together with a colleague of mine who I'm still in touch today, Mr. Eric Solheim from Norway, and we co-chair. And since that day, Singapore has always been looked upon as a country that can be sort of useful to that process to help with the UN process to arrive at an agreement. And my successor, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, continued that role and so on and so forth. So I've always seen that as a country, we have played an important part in really making sure that whatever agreement that is arrived at is not just useful to the big countries, but also to the small countries. So we are a representation with all the group of small countries, small island states, and so on and so forth. So the Copenhagen meeting for me was the most memorable meeting. For me, as sort of a young minister engaging in climate change, it was one of those things whereby you remember it for all the wrong reasons in Copenhagen. First of all, we had a meeting in Bali. We agreed that this is what we're going to achieve, and then in between Bali and Copenhagen, Minister Connie Hedegaard hosted many meetings. In Denmark, even we went even to Greenland, and so on and so forth to really understand climate change and see what we can do. And so we went to Copenhagen. We were full of, and my prime minister came. My prime minister and the minister for foreign affairs, Mr. Jayakumar, came because it was such an important meeting. Even President Obama came for that meeting. And I remembered two things, apart from the fact that I chaired that committee with Eric. There was a meeting between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton with the small island states. I remember being in that meeting where every representation from the small island states were either prime ministers or president. I was the only minister attending it, basically. And I told Madam Hillary Clinton that I'm not a prime minister, I'm just a small minister dealing my part. She just laughed it off, basically. So it was good that we were able to engage the world leaders. But the one meeting that I remember most was with President Obama. President Obama had came down to Copenhagen because he thought that we would arrive at an agreement. But the organizers were very selective, and Singapore was not selected to attend the meeting of Obama. And here I have to tell you a little secret. And the little secret was that I forced my way into the meeting, convinced the organizers that we should be there. They opened up the door and allowed my deputy secretary, Ms. Rosa Daniel, to attend the meeting on our behalf. So we were in the room and President Obama spoke with other leaders. And so you can ask her today what happened. She came back and reported to us. And so we were there to hear what Obama had to say about climate. Because the US was such an important player in climate change, and we engaged the US a lot. I still remember the negotiator, Mr. Thorston, and we engaged them a lot because we want to play our part. So I think Singapore as a small country, and we always use this term, we're energy disadvantaged country because we have, we may have sun all the time, but Louis, you must know that we don't have a lot of solar power in Singapore because of the cloud cover. We have no wind, we have no geothermal, we have nothing. All right, so we have to import our energy. But we also have to make sure that the world understands that small countries also have their concerns, how those concerns can be factored into the final agreement. So we saw that as our mission, and I think we played our part quite well. So I'm proud to be a part of that whole process. Now, I didn't sort of conclude it so far, but we started it. And today, I think we're an important player. And we get invited to all of the meetings because they know that we can contribute. So we show a level of seriousness and commitment to the issue. I just have to add one more point, which I think the world must understand. Actually, climate change is at the top of the agenda of the government's agenda. Our own Prime Minister raised it as an issue at one of the National Day rally and spoke about it as an existential threat. It will take 100 years, right, when the impact, but it is a 100-year problem that we have to tackle now. And he mentioned the fact that we're prepared to move, our resources and to tackle this problem. So I think that was a very important signal from our Prime Minister that the Singapore government is committed in dealing with the issues of climate change. So I'm proud of that moment when he mentioned at that rally. I was there. I said, it's a fantastic move, basically, that we have finally come full circle. From our early days of being reluctant to join, today we are becoming a very important champion of the climate change issue.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I think it really highlights how, no matter how small or insignificant you are, every little effort counts towards the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's true. And I think Singapore has done quite a lot, including your efforts from your team. I'm just really curious since now we're coming back to the present day. We just had a lot of extreme weather patterns. And recently, last month, we recorded the hottest day temperature in the month of May. What are your thoughts on the impact of those climate change commitments that we made? Has it really worked out?
Well, I think we're on track. You always wish that we could have done things faster, but we're on track to achieve our targets. You mentioned earlier about electric vehicles. We've decided by 2040, right, we will eliminate all ICE or internal combustion engine vehicles. By 2030, we will not import any more internal combustion engine cars. We are basically now having electric vehicles. We are building chargers across the island, electric chargers. And I think the most important thing, we give subsidies for Singaporeans to buy an electric vehicle. So the government really put resources where it matters. I think that's something we should be to acknowledge and thank the government for doing so. On the other hand, obviously, we had to continue to grow, So one of the challenges that I faced in my ministry after I left the environment ministry, which is communications information, was data centers. We need to bring data centers into Singapore, right? Because being a data hub is very important as an important node, but data centers consume a lot of energy, right, to keep it cooled down. So we are now working with the data centers owners to basically make it green as much as possible. There's been a lot of discussion, in fact, research by the National Research Foundation in Singapore to see how we can reduce the energy consumption and making sure that the systems can continue to function even in a very different climatic environment so that you can continue to become a data hub. So this is the balancing act. We want data centers because it creates good jobs, but we want to also make sure that our environment is protected. We can't change the environment, but we can change the data center, how it's being operated, how it's being run, how energy is being consumed. So I think that's what we are doing now, and I'm cheered by what I've read, even though I've left the ministry, what they are trying to do to change our data center to be more green. And meanwhile, I think all our sustainable plan will continue to be rolled out. We're planting more trees, having more greenery. We are convincing Singaporeans to take electric vehicles. We're providing more public transport. We're trying to recycle more because we're producing a lot of waste, trying to convince Singaporeans that they have to play their part to recycle as much as possible. So the efforts all moving in different fronts, basically. Some faster than others. Some, I think, need to be a big push. I think the problem has always been this, we did not design the country to be an environmentally friendly country. It was never designed that way. We are not trying to retrofit, but for new designs, we're trying to make it as friendly as possible. So new HDB flats, these are public housing flats in Singapore. We're trying to build it as green as possible. But what do you do with the stock of flats that you have? How do you change it, right? I think the one important factor in environmental challenge, climate change challenge, is actually human behavior. I've always believed we should tackle that head on, convince Singaporeans that they can play their part to make a difference, right? And the small things that they can do, starting from young, starting in schools to convince young people that they have a role to play. And I think that's where we need to focus our next, because we can push the limits for everything else. But if human behavior does not change, you can never achieve the targets that we want. Like taking a shower, basically, right? You don't have to take long showers. You take enough shower, you save enough water, basically, right? To remember, switch off your lights, use the air conditioning only when you need, and so on and so forth. So there's a little behavioral change, basically. But how to connect those dots to the larger picture is the biggest challenge, so that people see if I switch off the aircon, actually I'm saving the environment. If I save the water, actually I'm saving the environment. If I recycle that plastic bag, I'm saving the environment. So that narrative, has to be continued, sort of roll out in using podcasts, using TikTok, using whatever to reach out to the younger population, basically, right? And then convince them this has to be done. I think that will be our next big challenge, changing human behavior as much as possible. And you appeal to many things. Some people appeal to religious belief. Some people appeal to the impact it is on the next generation, that you are supposed to be a steward. You're not owner of the earth. You are supposed to be a steward. And so there have been many narratives, which is interesting to read. Which one makes a difference? Which one will move the needle, as we like to say in Singapore? Nobody knows. But if you ask me, you should try everything, right? You should use the religious path. You should use everything. So sometimes, as a Muslim, I attend my Friday prayers like Christians attend Sunday churches. Our sermon, sometimes we peppered it with a bit of an environmental talk. Verses in the Quran that says you must save the environment. And we do this so that people are convinced. So I think we should try all means and methods available out there which are legal to change human behavior as much as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, it just highlights the importance of involvement when it comes to enacting environmental improvements, right? It's not just only the individual, it's also the community, it's also the government that plays a huge part in this, and also corporations.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. All right. I think you have shared so many useful insights from your experiences. I'll pass the time back to Louis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Listen.
Perfect. I think the climate activism is a good example. Here in Brazil and in several countries across the world, in Europe, in several regions across the world. So it's interesting. And speaking of engaging people, here on Social Stats Podcast, we have listeners from different countries around the world. I was speaking with that with Lucian before our conversation. There are listeners from the Philippines, the United States, Chile, but there is a common thing that everybody loves: the public sector. Everybody loves the public sector. Everybody wants to create social impact. So, Jakob, my question: which books, documentaries, movies would you recommend, or a career advice would you recommend to someone who wants to work in the public sector?
Okay, if it's just specifically the public sector, I wouldn't have a particular book or a particular documentary because I think uh, context matters, right? The country matters. For example, Singapore is, a very small country, right? And we have a very simple parliamentary system, a government that's committed to excellence. And so, if you join the public sector, be it as a civil servant or as a politician, I mean, you must be committed to those values, basically. So, I think understanding your context is very important. What does it mean to be a civil servant in Singapore, to be a politician in Singapore, compared to in Brazil or in China or in the Philippines? So, understand your context, understand the issues that resonate with your countrymen. What are the things which are on the topmost of their mind? So read the newspapers, read the magazines that cover the current affairs and the issues of the day. I think keep yourself abreast with those ideas. Let me go back to my earlier story when I said I wasn't ready in 1991. Actually, I spent a lot of time during that period going into a deeper dive of my own community and Singapore at large, reading some of the books, reading some of the history to understand what are the things that matters to Singapore and Singaporeans. I think that is what you need to do because you are going to be part of that system that will change people's life. You must play a part in that process. In order to play that part, you have to have knowledge and information. You need to have some understanding of what resonates and what do not resonate, basically, right? So I think that is my simple advice. But if you want to find a career in environment, for example, actually I have one series I would recommend. In fact, I will have two series now that come to mind. The first one, of course, is the Attenborough series, Life on Earth. I remember watching that series actually as a young student. It's beautiful talking about the entire ecosystem on Earth minus the human beings. Talk about animals, talk about insects, talk about wildlife, and the way he brings his enthusiasm into the movie, into the documentary, really moves you. I was young, impressionable. I said, "Wow!" Until today, I subscribe to some of the streaming services that has his documentaries. I continue to watch one of them. That is brilliant. The other documentary that I would recommend is by the late astronomer Carl Sagan, Cosmos. And if you listen to Cosmos, you realize how small you are. You're this one little dot, in this huge universe, you know, and therefore you should be humble about your presence on Earth and that you are part of this ecosystem you have to do. Carl Sagan has such a great voice, and when he speaks, he really evokes those emotions. So those are the two, to me, I grew up with great documentaries that sort of, in a way, play my part in terms of going into the environment. But for career in public sector and public service, my most sort of meaningful advice I can share is understand your context, understand your people, understand your need. I want to end with a little story, and I thought this story is very interesting. As I told you, I'm an engineering student, and I'm much older than all of you who are listening in, perhaps, but I was doing engineering in Singapore in the 70s, late 70s. And at that time, the government was trying to humanize our engineers. So they introduced subject matters into engineering faculty, and one of them was on sociology. It was a non-examinable subject, but you have to go through it and you have to mark your attendance. It was taught by a very young graduate student. I still remember her. She was doing her PhD in NUS and she was our teacher. And I was the one who was listened to it because, like you, Luis, I love sociology. I love about society. And she told a simple story. And this was a story in India where the government decided to upgrade the roads in the countryside and therefore they paved it. They paved it, with the usual rate, cement or whatever, bitumen, all that stuff, so that then it's much easier. But then after they have built the road, they realize that the farmers and the bullock carts don't use the roads. They bring their bullock carts and their cows to bring them to wherever they're going on the side road. And they didn't understand why. Finally, they saw what was going on. The reason why they wanted the cows to be on the side road so that you can chew on the grass as it's actually going to bring you to the town. If you're on the bitumen road, there's no grass, there's no food. So then the engineers realized it. Actually, you don't need a road, right? You need the paved road to be nicely and put grass so that then the farmers will use it because they are trying to feed the cows also as the cows or the buffaloes are pulling, the cart towards their destination. So context matters. Understanding the needs of the community matters. And then you can come up with great policies. That's my 2 cents worth, Luis. Thank you.
Just a comment. I love Cosmos as well. The new version is amazing, but the old version has, I don't know, I can't explain that. My father is a big fan of Cosmos.
Yes.
And I must confess that I became a big fan of Vangelis because of Cosmos as well.
Yeah, it's a fantastic CSI.
And a final question,
Sure.
Jakob. A final message for those who want to create social change?
I think very simple. Go out to your neighborhood, go out to your community, and understand the needs of your community and see whether you can make a difference. Right? It is, as I said, it's not about splitting the atom or finding a cure for cancer. It's making that little difference to the lives of the people around you. If you can do that, I think you have great social change. So start small, understand the community, engage them, be close to them, and see what their needs are, and then find a solution for their needs so that then you can bring that small change, but to them a significant change in their lives. That is my message to all of you who want to involve in societal change. All right, we always think of big ideas, but everything starts from something very, very small. And I think your immediate community will be the community that you should pay attention to. Because there are problems there that we don't understand unless we deep dive and understand them basically. I think that is the first step that you should take if you want to do societal change. Thank you.
Well, Jakob, thank you. Wonderful words, I have to say. Thank you very much for your time and conversation. I always say to the foreign ministers of state I speak that I actually have I have other 10 questions to ask, but I will ask these questions maybe in another conversation.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, but you are more than welcome to a second conversation, Jakob, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. And Lucian, thank you for your insightful participation. As I like to say, sharing such special moments with friends is great. I hope you enjoyed this experience. And I'm glad to say you are now a part of this family. I am very glad to say that. The Social Stats family.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be on this podcast. I've learned a lot from you and from our guest today. This is really something that I would not be able to get from other sources, and I'm really appreciative that we're able to have this, I would say, more intimate conversation with the foreign minister, and it's wonderful. I think more people should, especially Singaporeans, should hear this and know how the government has been working on protecting and conserving our environment for the past decades.
That's great, my friend. Thank you very much. And for your listeners, thank you very much for following WAP Social Steps podcast. It's an honor to have you here. We will have another episode as soon.